The morning mist hung over Florence like a shroud, and, from his study window, Niccolò Machiavelli watched the city awaken to another day of political maneuvering and human weakness. At 53, having witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the corruption of republics, and the endless dance of power that consumed lesser men, he had arrived at a singular truth that would echo through the corridors of history. True dominion begins not with the conquest of territories or the subjugation of enemies, but with the absolute mastery of one's own inner realm. The weak man, Machiavelli understood, lives in constant reaction to the external world. He is a leaf blown by every wind of circumstance, his emotions dictating his actions, his fears determining his strategies. Such a man becomes predictable, and predictability in the game of power is tantamount to death. The strong man, however, constructs within himself an unassailable fortress of stillness, a place where passion may visit but never rule, where calculation reigns supreme over impulse, and where the self is forged into an instrument of pure will. In the swirling chaos of Renaissance Italy, where alliances shifted like sand and today's ally became tomorrow's executioner, Machiavelli had observed countless men destroy themselves through their inability to master their inner kingdoms. He had watched proud nobles fall to ruin because they could not control their pride, seen brilliant strategists undone by their inability to harness their emotions, and witnessed potential greatness squandered by men who remained slaves to their baser impulses. The weak self, Machiavelli realized, is not simply an inconvenience, it is an active enemy that undermines every strategy, compromises every advantage, and ultimately delivers its host into the hands of more disciplined adversaries. It whispers of comfort when hardship is required, of mercy when ruthlessness serves the greater good, and of immediate gratification when long-term vision demands sacrifice. This weak self is the true enemy that every aspiring leader must face, for it is the one opponent that can destroy them from within, making external enemies irrelevant. As Machiavelli penned his observations in the quiet hours before dawn, he understood that the creation of inner stillness was not merely a philosophical exercise but a practical necessity for survival in a world where weakness was immediately detected and ruthlessly exploited. The man who could not govern his own emotions had no business attempting to govern others. The leader who remained slave to his impulses would inevitably find himself enslaved by those who had achieved mastery over theirs. The process of destroying the weak self begins with brutal self-examination. A man must first acknowledge the extent to which his emotions, fears, and desires have been making decisions for him. He must recognize how often his reactions have been automatic rather than calculated, how frequently he has chosen the comfortable path over the necessary one, and how many opportunities he has squandered because he lacked the internal discipline to seize them. This recognition is painful, for it forces a man to confront the gap between who he believes himself to be and who he actually is when tested by circumstance. Machiavelli had learned this lesson through bitter experience. In his younger years, he had been subject to the same weaknesses that plagued other men. He had acted on emotion rather than calculation, had allowed personal preferences to cloud strategic judgment, and had occasionally chosen the path of least resistance when a harder choice would have served his interests better. It was only through repeated defeats and careful observation of both his own failures and the successes of others that he began to understand the fundamental truth: the external world responds to strength, and strength begins with self-mastery. The construction of inner stillness requires the systematic identification and elimination of emotional triggers that compromise judgment. When faced with insult, the weak man responds with anger, immediately revealing his vulnerabilities and often escalating conflicts unnecessarily. The man of stillness receives the same insult as information about his opponent's strategy and emotional state, using it to calibrate his response for maximum effect. When confronted with fear-inducing circumstances, the weak man either freezes or acts precipitously, both responses serving to diminish his power. The still man acknowledges fear as a signal to be more careful and methodical, transforming it from a liability into an asset. This transformation is not accomplished through the suppression of emotion, a strategy that inevitably fails under pressure, but through the development of an observational distance from one's own emotional reactions. The man of stillness learns to watch his emotions as he would watch the weather, noting their presence and intensity without being compelled to act upon them immediately. He develops the capacity to pause between stimulus and response, creating space for calculation where previously there had been only automatic reaction. In the political arena of Renaissance Florence, Machiavelli had observed this principle in action countless times. Those leaders who could maintain composure under pressure, who could think clearly while others panicked, and who could make decisions based on strategic considerations rather than emotional impulses, consistently outmaneuvered their more volatile counterparts. They were not necessarily more intelligent or better informed, but they possessed the crucial advantage of self-control that allowed them to utilize their intelligence and information effectively. The development of stillness also requires the cultivation of patience, perhaps the most difficult virtue for ambitious men to master. The weak self demands immediate gratification, quick victories, and instant validation. It grows restless during periods of apparent inactivity and pushes for action even when action would be counterproductive. The still man understands that power often requires waiting for the right moment, allowing situations to develop, and positioning oneself advantageously before making decisive moves. He learns to find satisfaction in the process of preparation rather than only in the achievement of goals. This patience extends to the management of one's public image and reputation. The weak man feels compelled to respond to every criticism, to defend against every slight, and to constantly promote his own interests. Such behavior reveals insecurity and creates unnecessary conflicts. The man of stillness allows his actions to speak for him, responds to criticism only when it serves a strategic purpose, and understands that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. He cultivates an aura of unpredictability by refusing to be drawn into the emotional reactions that others expect from him. The fortress of inner stillness also serves as a foundation for the development of what Machiavelli termed virtù, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but the ability to act decisively and effectively in pursuit of one's goals, regardless of external circumstances. This quality requires both the vision to see what must be done and the internal strength to do it, even when it conflicts with immediate desires or social expectations. The man who has not conquered his weak self lacks the foundation necessary for the development of true virtù, for his actions will always be compromised by the competing demands of his uncontrolled impulses. As the sun rose over Florence and the city began its daily business of trade, diplomacy, and intrigue, Machiavelli reflected on the countless men who would waste this day through their inability to master themselves. They would make decisions based on pride rather than prudence, react to events rather than shaping them, and allow their emotions to telegraph their intentions to more observant adversaries. Meanwhile, the few who had achieved true stillness would move through the same circumstances with the precision of a master craftsman, each action calculated for its effect, each response measured against long-term objectives. The destruction of the weak self is not a single achievement but an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance. The emotions and impulses that compromise judgment do not disappear once conquered, they merely become more subtle in their attempts to regain control. The man of stillness must maintain his observational distance from these internal forces, recognizing when they attempt to influence his decisions and maintaining the discipline to base his actions on calculation rather than feeling. This requires the development of what might be called emotional intelligence, not the ability to better express emotions, but the ability to better control and utilize them. In practical terms, this meant that every interaction, every decision, and every response should be evaluated not for its emotional satisfaction but for its strategic value. When faced with an enemy's provocation, the question becomes not "how do I feel about this," but "how does my response serve my larger objectives?" When presented with an opportunity that appeals to immediate desires, the question becomes not "do I want this," but "does this advance my position or compromise it?" This shift from emotional to strategic thinking transforms every aspect of a man's engagement with the world. The man who successfully destroys his weak self discovers that he becomes increasingly difficult for others to manipulate or predict. His responses are based on calculation rather than emotion, making him a challenging opponent and a valuable ally. He no longer provides the emotional reactions that others might use against him, and he develops the capacity to see clearly through the emotional manipulations that others attempt to employ. This clarity of perception becomes a significant advantage in any competitive environment. Furthermore, the achievement of inner stillness creates a kind of magnetic effect on others. People are naturally drawn to those who appear to be in complete control of themselves, sensing strength and competence even when they cannot articulate what they are perceiving. This attraction is not based on charisma in the conventional sense, but on the unmistakable presence of someone who has mastered the fundamental challenge that most people struggle with throughout their lives, the government of their own inner kingdom. Part 2, The Cold Mathematics of Strategic Dominance. The afternoon shadows stretched across the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio as Machiavelli made his way through the corridors of power, observing the eternal dance of ambition and miscalculation that played out daily in the heart of Florentine government. Here, more than anywhere, he had learned to appreciate the cold mathematics that governed all human interactions, the precise calculations that separated those who wielded power from those who merely occupied positions of authority. The weak man approaches strategy as an emotional exercise, allowing his personal preferences, moral inclinations, and immediate desires to influence decisions that should be based purely on mathematical probability and strategic advantage. He chooses allies based on personal affinity rather than mutual benefit, makes enemies through emotional reactions rather than calculated necessity, and pursues objectives because they appeal to his vanity rather than because they serve his larger interests. Such a man may occasionally succeed through luck or the incompetence of his opponents, but he will never achieve the consistent dominance that comes from treating strategy as a science rather than an art. The man of stillness, having destroyed his weak self, approaches every strategic situation with the cold precision of a chess master, evaluating each move not for its emotional appeal but for its effect on the larger game. He understands that power operates according to natural laws as predictable as those governing physics, and he shapes his actions to work with these laws rather than against them. Where the weak man sees complexity and confusion, the still man sees patterns and opportunities. In the court of Duke Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli had witnessed this principle in its most refined form. The Duke approached every political situation with mathematical precision, calculating the exact amount of fear and favor necessary to maintain control, measuring the loyalty of his subordinates not through sentiment but through analysis of their interests, and timing his actions to maximize their psychological impact. When the Duke ordered the execution of his lieutenant Ramiro de Orco, placing the man's body in the public square of Cesena, it was not an act of anger or cruelty but a calculated demonstration designed to achieve specific objectives, to distance himself from the harsh measures Ramiro had implemented on his behalf, to demonstrate his power over even his most trusted lieutenants, and to provide the people with a symbolic resolution to their grievances. The weak man would have seen brutality and perhaps felt moral revulsion. The Duke saw a mathematical equation: the temporary shock and fear generated by this action would be more than offset by the long-term stability achieved through the clear demonstration of absolute authority. The calculation proved correct, the regions settled into peaceful compliance that lasted for years. This is the difference between emotional reaction and strategic thinking: one focuses on immediate feelings, the other on long-term results. The cold mathematics of power begins with the accurate assessment of all parties' true interests, stripped of the ideological language and moral posturing that usually obscures them. Every individual and group acts primarily in pursuit of their perceived self-interest, though they may disguise this motivation behind elaborate justifications of principle or necessity. The man who can see through these disguises and identify the underlying interests possesses a tremendous advantage in predicting behavior and crafting effective strategies. This analysis extends to understanding the different types of power that exist in any given situation. There is formal power, derived from official positions and legal authority, but this is often less significant than informal power derived from personal relationships, control of resources, access to information, or the ability to influence public opinion. The weak man focuses on formal power because it is obvious and appeals to his need for recognition. The still man maps the entire power structure, including its hidden elements, and positions himself to leverage the forms of power that others overlook. The mathematics of timing represents another crucial element that separates strategic masters from their inferiors. Every action has an optimal moment for execution, determined by the convergence of favorable circumstances and the alignment of various forces. The weak man acts when he feels ready or when external pressure compels action, often missing these optimal windows entirely. The still man studies the rhythm of events, identifies the patterns that precede opportunities, and positions himself to act decisively when circumstances align in his favor. Machiavelli had observed this principle during the rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who briefly dominated Florence through the power of religious fervor. Savonarola's initial success came from his perfect timing. He emerged during a period when the Florentines were disillusioned with corruption and ready for moral leadership. However, his failure stemmed from his inability to recognize when the moment for religious authoritarianism had passed and the people had grown weary of his restrictions. A man of true strategic intelligence would have evolved his approach as circumstances changed, but Savonarola remained trapped by his emotional investment in a particular identity and method. The cold mathematics of strategy also requires the accurate measurement of risk versus reward in every decision. The weak man either avoids all risk due to fear or embraces excessive risk due to emotional excitement. The still man calculates precisely, understanding that the goal is not to avoid risk entirely but to ensure that potential rewards justify the risks undertaken. This requires not only the ability to accurately assess probabilities but also the emotional discipline to accept uncertainty and act decisively despite incomplete information. In the realm of alliances and partnerships, mathematical thinking reveals truths that emotional approaches obscure. The value of any alliance is determined not by personal affinity or shared ideals but by the practical benefits each party brings and the likelihood of continued cooperation. The weak man forms alliances based on friendship or ideological agreement, only to discover that these bonds dissolve under pressure. The still man forms alliances based on mutual interest and maintains them through the careful management of benefits and dependencies. This approach extends to the management of subordinates and the construction of organizational loyalty. The weak man believes that loyalty can be purchased through generosity or inspired through charisma, failing to understand that true loyalty is based on the subordinates' calculation that their interests are better served through continued cooperation than through defection. The still man creates structures of incentive and consequence that make loyalty the rational choice while maintaining enough unpredictability to prevent subordinates from taking his support for granted. The mathematics of information control represents another dimension of strategic dominance that weak men consistently underestimate. In any competitive situation, the party with superior information possesses a decisive advantage, but this advantage extends beyond simply knowing more facts. It includes understanding what others know, what they think they know, and what they want to know. The still man treats information as a strategic resource to be gathered, protected, and deployed with the same care that a general manages his ammunition. This principle manifests in the careful management of one's own transparency and mystery. The weak man either reveals too much in his desire to appear honest and forthright, or conceals so much that he appears untrustworthy and paranoid. The still man calculates precisely what information to reveal and what to conceal, understanding that mystery creates power while transparency can invite manipulation. He shares enough information to build necessary trust while maintaining enough uncertainty to preserve his strategic options. The cold mathematics of strategy also governs the optimal use of both force and favor in achieving compliance. The weak man relies too heavily on one approach or the other, either attempting to coerce everyone through threats or trying to win everyone through kindness. The still man understands that both approaches have their proper applications and that the most effective strategy often involves the calculated combination of both. He studies each situation to determine whether force or favor will be more effective, often finding that the threat of force makes the actual use of force unnecessary, while the memory of past favor makes current force more acceptable. In his observations of Cesare Borgia's campaigns, Machiavelli had noted the Duke's masterful alternation between these approaches. When entering new territories, Borgia often began with displays of overwhelming force designed to eliminate resistance before it could organize. Once control was established, he would shift to generous treatment of the conquered population, winning their acceptance through effective governance and economic opportunity. This sequence was not random but calculated. Force established the reality of his power, while subsequent favor made that power seem legitimate and beneficial rather than merely oppressive. The mathematics of reputation management requires similar precision. Reputation is a form of accumulated power that can be leveraged to achieve results with minimal effort, but it must be carefully constructed and maintained. The weak man allows his reputation to develop accidentally, often undermining it through inconsistent behavior or unnecessary controversies. The still man treats reputation as a strategic asset, making calculated choices about when to fulfill expectations and when to surprise observers, when to appear predictable and when to demonstrate unexpected capabilities. This extends to the management of both fear and affection in one's relationships with others. As Machiavelli famously observed, it is better to be feared than loved if one cannot be both, but this principle requires nuanced application. The optimal strategy is to be feared for one's capabilities while being respected for one's restraint in using them. This combination creates what might be called comfortable fear. Others recognize your power but believe you will use it fairly and, predictably, making cooperation preferable to opposition. The cold mathematics of strategic thinking also reveals the importance of maintaining multiple options and avoiding commitments that cannot be reversed. The weak man often makes irreversible decisions based on temporary circumstances or emotional states, finding himself trapped in positions that no longer serve his interests. The still man structures his commitments to preserve flexibility, understanding that circumstances change and that the ability to adapt is often more valuable than any particular position. This principle applies to everything from personal relationships to business partnerships to political alliances. The goal is not to avoid all commitments but to ensure that commitments serve strategic purposes and can be modified or terminated when they no longer do so. This requires both the practical skill of structuring agreements appropriately and the emotional discipline to make decisions based on strategic value rather than personal attachment. Part 3, The Eternal Fortress of Self-Sovereignty. As twilight descended upon Florence and the last merchants closed their stalls in the shadow of the cathedral dome, Machiavelli sat in his study surrounded by the chronicles of empires and the testimonies of power. The candle flame flickered against the gathering darkness, and, in its wavering light, he contemplated the final truth that separated the eternally strong from the temporarily powerful, that true invincibility comes not from the conquest of external enemies but from the construction of an inner fortress so complete that destruction from without becomes impossible. The man who has destroyed his weak self and mastered the cold mathematics of strategy might achieve temporary dominance, but lasting power requires something more fundamental, the creation of a state of being that cannot be diminished by external circumstances, undermined by the actions of others, or corrupted by the passage of time. This is the achievement of absolute self-sovereignty, a condition in which one's essential strength derives not from position, wealth, or the cooperation of others, but from the unassailable fortress of disciplined consciousness that no external force can breach. The weak man builds his sense of power on foundations that others can destroy, reputation that can be slandered, wealth that can be seized, positions that can be stripped away, allies who can betray, and capabilities that can be neutralized. He remains perpetually vulnerable because his strength depends on factors beyond his complete control. He lives in constant anxiety about protecting what he has built and constant fear of losing what he has gained. This anxiety and fear, even when carefully concealed, influence his decisions and ultimately limit his effectiveness. The sovereign man, by contrast, builds his power on the one foundation that remains completely within his control, the disciplined cultivation of his own consciousness and will. He develops capabilities that cannot be taken from him, wisdom that cannot be stolen, and an internal state that remains unshakable regardless of external circumstances. When others threaten his position, they discover they are attacking something less vulnerable than they anticipated. When they attempt to manipulate him through fear or desire, they find their leverage ineffective. When they try to predict his behavior based on conventional motivations, they encounter something more complex and resilient than expected. This state of self-sovereignty begins with the recognition that all external circumstances, including both favorable and unfavorable ones, are temporary and ultimately beyond complete control. The weak man invests his emotional energy in attempting to control outcomes that lie partially or entirely beyond his influence, experiencing constant stress from this impossible task. The sovereign man focuses his energy exclusively on those elements that remain within his complete control: his responses to circumstances, his interpretation of events, his choices about where to direct his attention, and his decisions about how to utilize his time and energy. This shift in focus from outcomes to process creates a profound transformation in how one experiences both success and failure. The weak man experiences success as validation of his worth and failure as evidence of his inadequacy, making both emotional states sources of weakness, success creating complacency and fear of loss, failure creating doubt and paralysis. The sovereign man experiences both success and failure as information about the effectiveness of his strategies and the nature of his environment, using each to refine his understanding and improve his future decisions without allowing either to affect his fundamental sense of capability and worth. In his years of political exile and personal hardship following the collapse of the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli had been forced to discover this truth through direct experience. Stripped of his position, banned from the city he had served, and reduced to relative poverty, he could have allowed these circumstances to define his reality and diminish his sense of possibility. Instead, he chose to treat this period as an opportunity to develop capabilities that did not depend on external validation or support. He wrote, he studied, he observed, and he refined his understanding of the principles that govern human behavior and political power. During these years of apparent defeat, Machiavelli actually developed the insights that would make his influence eternal. The man who held no office and commanded no armies became the teacher of kings and the architect of political understanding that would shape centuries of strategic thinking. This transformation was possible precisely because he had learned to derive his sense of power and purpose from sources that could not be diminished by external circumstances. The construction of absolute self-sovereignty requires the systematic development of what might be called internal resources, capabilities, and qualities that exist independently of external circumstances and cannot be taken away by others. These include the ability to think clearly under pressure, the capacity to find opportunity within apparent adversity, the skill of learning from every experience regardless of whether it is pleasant or painful, and the discipline to maintain long-term perspective even when immediate circumstances are challenging. Perhaps most importantly, self-sovereignty requires the development of what Machiavelli termed virtue in its highest form, not merely the ability to act decisively when circumstances are favorable, but the capacity to create favorable circumstances through the force of one's own will and intelligence, regardless of the starting position. This represents the transformation from someone who succeeds when conditions are right to someone who makes conditions right through the application of superior understanding and unwavering determination. The sovereign man also develops a relationship with uncertainty that transforms it from a source of anxiety into a source of power. Where the weak man demands certainty and becomes paralyzed when it is unavailable, the sovereign man learns to operate effectively within uncertainty, using his superior adaptability and decision-making capability as advantages over those who require more predictable conditions. He understands that uncertainty creates opportunities for those prepared to act decisively while others hesitate. This mastery of uncertainty extends to the management of one's own emotional and psychological state. The weak man's internal condition fluctuates with external circumstances, confident when things go well, anxious when they go poorly, excited by praise, deflated by criticism. The sovereign man maintains a stable internal condition that serves as a platform for effective action regardless of external fluctuations. This stability is not emotional numbness but rather emotional sophistication, the ability to feel emotions without being controlled by them and to use them as sources of information rather than sources of compulsion. The development of self-sovereignty also requires what might be called existential independence, the ability to find meaning and purpose that do not depend on the approval, cooperation, or validation of others. The weak man derives his sense of purpose from external sources, the approval of his peers, the achievement of socially recognized goals, or the fulfillment of expectations imposed by others. When these external sources are threatened or withdrawn, his sense of purpose collapses. The sovereign man develops purposes that arise from his own deepest understanding and values, making him immune to the manipulation that comes through threatening his sense of meaning. This independence extends to the realm of identity itself. The weak man defines himself through his roles, possessions, relationships, and achievements, all elements that can be altered or lost through circumstances beyond his complete control. The sovereign man defines himself through qualities and capabilities that cannot be taken from him, his ability to think, to choose, to learn, to adapt, and to create value regardless of circumstances. This foundation of identity cannot be shaken by external events because it does not depend on them. In practical terms, the achievement of self-sovereignty manifests as an almost supernatural resilience in the face of adversity and an equally remarkable immunity to corruption in the face of success. The sovereign man can lose everything external and begin rebuilding immediately because his essential capabilities remain intact. He can gain great external power without being corrupted by it because his sense of worth does not depend on maintaining that power. This creates a paradox: those least attached to power are often most capable of wielding it effectively, while those most desperate for power are often least capable of maintaining it. The sovereign state also generates what might be called gravitational power, the tendency to attract opportunities, allies, and resources without actively pursuing them. This occurs because self-sovereignty creates a rare combination of competence and stability that others naturally want to associate with. The sovereign man becomes valuable to others not because he needs them but because he can contribute to their success without requiring constant management or emotional support. This reversal, becoming powerful through not needing power, represents one of the most profound insights of Machiavellian thought. Furthermore, the sovereign man develops the capacity to operate across multiple time horizons simultaneously. Where the weak man is trapped either in immediate concerns or distant dreams, the sovereign man can pursue long-term objectives while handling immediate challenges effectively, can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent direction, and can make strategic sacrifices when necessary while preserving essential capabilities. This temporal flexibility becomes crucial in complex environments where success requires both tactical responsiveness and strategic consistency. The fortress of self-sovereignty also provides protection against the most subtle forms of attack, those that attempt to compromise one's thinking, corrupt one's values, or manipulate one's emotions. The weak man is vulnerable to propaganda, flattery, intimidation, and other forms of psychological manipulation because his internal state depends partly on external inputs. The sovereign man processes all external information through his own developed judgment, making him extremely difficult to manipulate or mislead. He can listen to flattery without being influenced by it, can face threats without being intimidated by them, and can consider opposing viewpoints without being confused by them. As the candle burned lower and the night deepened around Florence, Machiavelli reflected on the ultimate irony of power, that those who achieve true self-sovereignty often find that external power becomes less necessary even as it becomes more accessible. The man who cannot be destroyed by others has less need to destroy them. The man who cannot be manipulated has less need to manipulate. The man who cannot be diminished by circumstances has less need to control them completely. This does not make such men passive or ineffective, quite the opposite. It makes them more discerning about when and how to apply their capabilities, more strategic in their use of force and favor, and more effective in their pursuit of meaningful objectives. The sovereign man understands that the highest form of victory is not the defeat of external enemies but the construction of a state of being that makes such defeats unnecessary. When others cannot diminish your essential power, many conflicts become pointless. When others cannot predict or manipulate your behavior, many forms of opposition become ineffective. When others cannot shake your fundamental stability, many threats lose their power to compel. This is the ultimate expression of Machiavellian wisdom, that the strongest fortress is not built of stone and steel but of disciplined consciousness and unshakable will. In the end, the man who has destroyed his weak self, mastered the cold mathematics of strategy, and constructed the eternal fortress of self-sovereignty achieves something that no external enemy can destroy because it exists in a realm beyond their reach. He becomes not merely powerful but truly free from the compulsions that drive other men, free from the fears that limit their actions, and free from the dependencies that make them vulnerable. This freedom becomes the foundation for a form of power that can adapt to any circumstances, survive any adversity, and create value in any environment. This is the cold rule that Machiavelli discovered in the shadows of Renaissance Italy, that those who master themselves completely need never fear those who have mastered only others. The weak can destroy the weak, and the strong can destroy the weak, but only the internally destroyed, those who have systematically eliminated their own weaknesses, can achieve the kind of strength that cannot be diminished by any external force. They become, in the truest sense, indestructible not because they cannot be harmed, but because they cannot be fundamentally weakened. And, in that indestructibility lies the secret of eternal power, the recognition that the greatest empire is not one built across territories but one constructed within the disciplined consciousness of a truly sovereign mind.